Good evening. I'm Nicholas Paul Breisowitz, Director of Development here at the Long Now Foundation, and as always, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. By a quick show of applause, how many of you out there tonight are stainless steel card-carrying members of the Long Now Foundation? That's incredible. Our membership program is about to clear 10,000 members across more than 60 countries. And that membership really has become the foundation of our foundation. Your regular support is a significant fraction of our overall operating budget every single year, and it allows us to do what we do. So in a very real way, we couldn't do that without you, so thank you. The other significant fraction of our operating budget comes from our annual fundraising campaign at the end of every single year. Like many nonprofit organizations, the Long Now Foundation raises an astounding percentage of our operating budget between now and the end of the year. And this regular seasonality means that for 10 months out of the year, we get to do a lot of giving. We get to give away ideas and conversations and content and public space. And for 2 months out of the year, we get to ask you to help us do more of that. So this year, if you're interested and if you're able to help us do more long-term thinking in the world, I'd like to invite you to either make a special tax-deductible donation or upgrade your membership level or claim one of those bottles of exclusive spirits in the ceiling at the interval. Or if you'd like, you can also reserve one of these. Some of you may have seen this object before, but this is the equation of time cam. And it's a vital component of the 10,000-year clock. This unique shape is a physical instantiation of a math equation that accounts for the dynamic motion of our home planet across the next 10 millennia. You can almost think of it as the heart of the clock. And a few years ago, we manufactured a limited edition of these, and as part of our annual fundraising campaign today, I'm excited to announce that we've just launched a brand new custom machined edition of the equation of time cam that was manufactured in the exact same clock shop that did a lot of the clock parts. And so if you want to learn more about this piece, you can visit longnow.org/artifacts, check out this and some of our other artifacts. And of course, you didn't come here tonight to hear me talk about fundraising campaigns and clock parts. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our long short. As some of you know, we always kind of set the tone for the evening with a brief video. And tonight's video is, in a way, about networks. Thank you so much.
That's, hi, I'm Stuart Brand from Long Now. That's a tiny sample of what passenger pigeons used to do. And if all goes well, we'll do again. Only they did it 60 miles an hour in a straight line from one place to another, and then all that swarming when they landed. By the way, one further note on that beautiful equation of time cam that's made out of bronze. The donation that gets it is $2,500. And since the unit cost on those beautifully crafted things is about $900, it's a pretty good deal. The conceit of the Long Now Foundation is that we're sort of in the midst of a 20,000-year story of civilization, dating back to the first towns and agriculture and dating forward to what remains to be seen and what remains to be done. And as a consequence, we're sort of in love with historians who are all about telling the long story in ever new ways. And civilization's story is basically a story of argument, swarms of arguments. And these arguments get played out in terms often of power. There's an argument about economic power, there's arguments about political power, arguments about military power. And from time to time, arguments about the whole mode that power gets played out in. And that's what we hear about tonight from historian Niall Ferguson.
Thank you very much indeed, Stuart. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you for braving the air to join us. You may have heard it announced today that the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner will no longer feature a comedian, but a historian, which made me think that perhaps history was the new comedy. I do not intend to give you stand-up tonight. Let me disillusion you. What I want to do is talk about networks and power. I'll be talking quite a bit about what's in my most recent book, The Square and the Tower. But I'll also be trying to go a little further than I did in that book, thinking about what we need to do if we are to manage what has been created, the extraordinary giant online social networks made in Northern California in our time. The Long Now, I guess, is an attempt to situate the present. And I have always admired what Stuart and his colleagues have done in helping us to understand our position in a continuum of human history over thousands of years. But the corollary of the long now is the short then. And the short then is a phrase that hit me as I was hurtling up 280 this evening. What I want to convey to you is how near the past is and how relevant it is to the problems that we confront today. And that some of the things that we know about events 500 years ago can illuminate our long now. If you want to get a handle on that relationship between networks and hierarchies that's central to the Square and the Tower, go to Siena, one of the most beautiful towns in all of Italy, and look at the extraordinary juxtaposition in the center of Siena of the Piazza del Campo, the square, one of the most beautiful squares in all of Italy, and the Torre del Mangia, which casts a long shadow over it. The square is where the people of Siena network. It's where they hang out, chat, informally exchange, whether in a marketplace or even in a horse race between the local districts. The tower was part of the Palazzo Pubblico, where the government of the Republic of Siena was located. And one of the ideas I want to convey to you tonight is that we today also live our lives partly in a square, partly in the realm of social networks, but also partly in the realm of hierarchies. I'm a kind of networks person. I've always hated hierarchies. I would have been terrible in the military. Even academic structures of governance slightly unnerved me. I became an academic because it seemed to me that universities were the least hierarchical of organizations. And so I kind of naturally prefer to be in the horizontal realm of the town square. But I can't escape the hierarchies of universities and of governments. Whether we like it or not, we're all situated partly in the square and partly in the town. Now, it's a cliche of our time, but like many cliches, it's true, that the world has never been as networked as it is today. And that is, I think, the case. Certainly when you look at the way that network platforms, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, the way those companies have built giant online social networks, there's never been anything quite like that before. Today's networks are very large, and they're fast. They operate much more rapidly than previous networks could because of technology. I quite like this visualization of the Facebook network. Put your hand up if you're on Facebook. Go on, don't pretend you're not. So, to an extraordinary extent, mankind is on Facebook, 2.27 billion regular users. And this map tries to plot every city pair with what's called a great circle line. And the transparency of each of these great circle lines is determined by the number of friend pairs in the cities. Hence the extraordinary brightness of North America, where Facebook originated, and the extraordinary darkness of the People's Republic of China, where it's still not admitted. We were told, and I think most of us believed it, that if everybody was connected, then everything would be awesome. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. John Perry Barlow, the late lamented, epitomized the libertarian spirit of the early internet. And the idea that if we're all connected, it will be awesome, has persisted in much that Mark Zuckerberg has said as Facebook has grown. This was him speaking at the Harvard commencement last year. All people want to connect. The great arc of human history bends towards people coming together in ever greater numbers to achieve things we couldn't on our own. That was the promise. I think most of us believed it. And then came 2016, the annus horribilis of the liberal internet. Political events, first in Britain in June of 2016, then in the United States in November of 2016, came as a huge shock because it turned out that the network platforms, that the tools that had been created by Silicon Valley could be used for purposes that were certainly far from utopian. I got to know Evan Williams recently. He's a really nice guy, very impressive. But he said something last year that went to the heart of the matter. I thought once everybody could speak freely and exchange information and ideas, the world is automatically going to be a better place. I was wrong about that. And I think most of us were wrong about that. And I think we all need to say to ourselves what Homer Simpson often says to himself, well, though. The Square and the Tower is about why it all went a bit wrong, and in particular, why both network science and history should have made us much more wary of the promise of a massively interconnected planet. Now, I say network science and history because part of what writing the book helped me do as an historian was to learn much more about network science than I had known before. A lot of my career had been spent writing about networks, partly because I'm temperamentally drawn to them. As I said before, I always found government archives slightly stuffy places, but private papers, the archives of companies, that always appealed to me more. But I'd used the word network very casually, like most people do. Oh, I'm going out networking tonight. I hadn't really understood the 6 great laws of network science, and it was when I started to read network scientists' work, like, say, Laszlo Barabasi's amazing book, Linked, or I started to read Nicholas Christakis' work on social networks, I suddenly realized this applies to history. And if we only think about history using these tools, we'll see it through completely fresh eyes. Once you understand the basic conceptual framework, everything, the present, the past, and potentially the futures that we confront looks different. If I could graph the social network of you all, as they say in Texas, if I could just know a little bit, maybe a lot about you all, if I could get Mark Zuckerberg to give me all your data, which he used to do, but it's got a little tougher, then I could graph the network. To me, you'd just be nodes, and the relationships between you would just be edges. And what would be fascinating would be that this would not be a lattice in which each node had the same number of edges as the rest. No social network is like that. There would be clusters. Some of you are quite closely connected. There's a little inner circle of long now lifers. And then there would be the network isolate, the person who came in here by mistake thinking it was jazz. Doesn't know anybody here, doesn't know who the hell I am, bit too embarrassed to get up and go yet. The hub of this network would be Stuart. Stuart has the highest betweenness centrality because for any 2 nodes in this network to connect, the quickest way is almost certainly through Stuart Brand. As I delved into this way of thinking about society and the connections between people, it was as if scales fell from my eyes and I began to see past work that I'd done in a completely different light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the 6 great truths about networks, borrowing from the work of network scientists. And then I'm going to do the big analogy. Because if you want to get from the long now to the short then, what you need is a big analogy. That's the history piece. And then, in the 4th quarter, I'm going to, as you're all beginning to nod off or check your devices, I've got eagle eyes for device checkers, so I'll cold call anybody I see on Facebook. In the final quarter, I'm going to tell you what this implies for our present predicament and what we need to do. That's not in the book, so you'll be in a unique position. Birds of a feather flock together. Okay, if we did the social network, if we graphed the network in here, it'd be quite interesting if we found what often turns out to be true of social networks, that there were 2 rather distinct clusters. There's a great illustration of this point in a recent paper by Brady and company, which shows the extraordinary polarization of political Twitter. And you can see here a graph that depicts retweet activity on political issues of American Twitter users. Liberals retweet liberals, And conservatives retweet conservatives, and there's hardly any retweet activity across the great political divide. We used to call it the political center. We now call it the killing zone. And for every moral or emotive word you use in a tweet, it is 20% more likely to be retweeted. So if you're wondering why there's so much strong language on Twitter, people have figured that out. This is not a new insight. Sociologists working in the 1970s knew that there was something called homophily. They knew it when they studied the networks of friendships in American high schools that were supposed to be racially integrated, but weren't, despite all the efforts of policymakers post the civil rights movement. Self-segregation was going on in these high schools, and self-segregation goes on the giant online social networks of our time. So homophily is the first law, and it should not have surprised us that creating giant online social networks would in fact create not one happy global community all sharing cat videos, but this. Second insight from network science. It's a small world because weak ties are strong. This draws on the work of eminent sociologists like Milgram and Granovetter. And the basic insight is that we all have our close circle of family and friends. But the reason that there are 6 degrees of separation, which started out as a short story and then turned out in Stanley Milgram's work to be true, is that our clusters of friends and family are all connected by the loose, casual acquaintances that we have. They act as bridges or connectors to other people's clusters of friends and family. And Milgram showed in a famous paper from 1967, these are the cheesy graphics from the paper, it was the 60s after all, that if you sent chain letters from random people in the Midwest that were designed to get to a particular individual in New England that none of them knew, it took 6 or 7 steps for the letter to get there. This was the first demonstration of the small world principle, that there are roughly 6 degrees of separation between any 2 randomly selected human beings. The third insight from network science is that stuff goes viral not just because of its content. I know. You think that something goes viral, the cat video that goes viral because it's a cool video. But it's not just that. It's not just the inherent content that matters. It is the structure of the network that the cat video attacks that matters. This is true in the study of epidemic disease, and it's true in the study of cultural memes. So that's the third key point to bear in mind. Network structure determines a lot. If you attack the network at the right point, if we give the meme to Stuart of the awesome cat video, it is much more likely to go viral than if we give it to the jazz fan who's too polite to leave. It's all about where you enter the network and what the network structure is like. If there is a node with high betweenness centrality, that's crucial to why things go viral. Fourth point, this was my attempt to distill all of network science into 6 things I could remember in talks. Networks never sleep. Networks are complex adaptive systems with emergent properties and phase transitions. And that's why the bird video at the beginning was so great, because that's a perfect illustration of what we mean by emergent properties, what we mean by a complex system. If only human beings were as good at networking as birds. And we're always colliding into one another. If it were human beings flying around up there above that field, after 10 minutes they would have formed 2 hostile clusters of conservative and liberal birds and have been flying at one another. So this is another important point to remember. There are lots of network graphs in this talk and in my book, but they're just snapshots of things that are constantly in flux And because they are truly complex adaptive systems, they don't behave in predictable ways. Weird stuff can happen. A network can go from being highly distributed and decentralized to being highly centralized in a matter of days. Example, the great revolutions of modern times. As I try to show in the book, the Bolshevik Revolution looked like a massive distributed network sweeping across the Russian Empire with minimal coordination. Lenin's message just went viral. But within a few years of the Bolshevik seizure of power, the Bolshevik network had gone from being decentralized to being highly centralized. A dictatorship of the proletariat, in fact, a dictatorship by the party elite. Talking of Bolsheviks, and I just made that segue up completely on the spur of the moment. One of the best examples of the attack syndrome, the fact that networks attack networks, was the attack by the Soviet communist regime on the elite intellectual networks of my country of origin, the United Kingdom. This is one of my favorite stories in the book. By the way, the book is full of stories. It's actually designed to be read by people with attention deficit disorder. I divided it up into 60 short chapters, and you don't need to read them all, or even read them in the right order. It's designed for people who keep checking their email. This is one of my favorite of the stories. It's the story of the Cambridge spies. The biggest success to date, including recent events, of Russian espionage. What did they do? They hacked an elite network, the apostles, the most elite of all the intellectual societies at the very pinnacle of Cambridge University's social life, the cleverest of the clever, the self-perpetuating elite that still exists today. And the apostles were hacked by a Soviet operative named Arnold Deutsch, who managed to recruit 3 of its members to the Communist Party, knowing that as members of the apostles, they would be highly likely to attain high positions in the British establishment, which they did, including high positions in British military intelligence. Networks attack networks. And it takes a network to defeat a network. A line I got from General Stanley McChrystal's book about his time in Iraq. I'm saving the 6th law of networks for just a little bit later. But now, the big analogy. And this is my favorite part, because this is the history part. So what is it like? That's the question you should always be asking about the present. What the hell is this like? And every day, in every edition of the New York Times, somebody will tell you that it's the 1930s. And then in the Washington Post, somebody will tell you that it's the 1970s. But I'm here to tell you that all these analogies with the mid-20th century are of no use at all. Because the structure of the public sphere has been changed so much by the internet that it's nothing like the mid-20th century, our time. Our time most closely resembles the period after the late 15th century, when the printing press, oh, you'll laugh, sir. That's what I like to hear, incredulity. Because it's a typical American response that anything that happened before the United States is irrelevant to the history of the United States. You're wrong. You're so wrong. Let me show you how wrong you are. Nothing has happened like the impact of the personal computer and the internet since the advent of the printing press. And here's the proof. If you look at the impact of these 2 technologies, and there's a wonderful paper by a guy named Dittmar in London who does this, it's incredibly similar. The effect of the technological innovation is drastically to reduce the cost of producing content and drastically to increase the volume of content. These two graphs are the same. One for the printed book, the other for the personal computer. What's the difference? The time scale. History today happens 10 times faster than it did at the time of the printing press. But that's the only significant difference, except for one more I'll come to. So the better analogy for thinking about our time is not the 1930s. It's not Watergate. That's all very interesting, but we live in a different time. We live at a time of massive technological disruption of the public sphere, and most of us underestimate it, especially those of us who cling to old ways of getting information like newspapers made of paper. We underestimate the extent to which our time is a time of communications revolution as dramatic as the time of the Reformation. Oh, yes. This is a scary analogy. It is not a funny analogy, sir. It is a bloody terrifying analogy, because when they introduced the printing press into Europe, everything was going to be awesome. Martin Luther, for it was he, just 501 years ago said, if everybody can read the Bible on a printed version of the text in their own language, everything will be awesome. He didn't quite use that word. What he actually said was, we'll achieve the priesthood of all believers the Bible speaks of. Not quite what happened. What happened was that, Martin Luther's sermons were rapidly spread throughout all of Europe thanks to rapid production by printing presses. But so were books like the Malleus Maleficarum, which argued that witches live amongst us and have to be burnt at the stake. That book, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Wickedness, was one of the best sellers of the 16th and 17th century. That's a good example of fake news. And it's a good example of something going viral that is a good deal more harmful than a cat video. You know how it is that people are always wanting to tear down statues these days? Have you noticed that? And rename things? Iconoclasm is a typical product of a disruption of the public sphere. Suddenly we must efface the icons of the previous era. That happened in the period of the Reformation too, as in this illustration of a church getting a full Protestant makeover in Antwerp in 1566. Polarization in the 16th and 17th century escalated rapidly from verbal violence, you're a heretic, no, you're a heretic, no, you are a heretic, into actual violence. The threshold between verbal violence and actual violence is a very fragile fence. And they crossed it. And they spent 130 years crossing it. The wars of religion that persisted from the peasants' revolt that followed Luther's Reformation all the way to the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. I sometimes think we're living through a secular Reformation. It's not religion, but political ideology. But it takes a similar form. There's a whole range of different things that we now categorize as hate speech. Well, in the 16th and 17th century, you didn't say hate speech, you said blasphemy. What we are experiencing, though it hasn't yet escalated to the levels of religious warfare, could. Because there's no obvious reason why the polarization process that I've described to you should stop. It's always important to think ahead to what Stuart will ask you. So, obviously, there are all kinds of differences between my short then and the long now. One of them I've mentioned already. Everything happens 10 times faster today. That's good news, They had 130 years of religious conflict. We should get it down to 13. They had the 30 Years' War. It'll only be 3 for us. There's another. So here's a really interesting thought that I had writing the book. After the printing press was invented, amazingly, it stayed a distributed network. And people didn't sell ads on most of what was printed. Very few ads on Luther's sermons you'll find. And that's the big difference between then and now. We thought that the internet was going to remain a decentralized thing. Tim Berners-Lee's vision of the World Wide Web was just like the birds flying around. Nobody's in charge. Everybody's just flying together. Woohoo! And then it turned out that unlike the printing press, you could centralize the internet. You could centralize the software. You could centralize e-commerce. You could centralize social networking. You could centralize digital media. The internet was supposed to usher in this wonderful era when we were all going to be netizens. Do you remember that? Seems like another world, doesn't it? We were going to all speak truth to power on our personal blogs, all at once. It's going to be awesome. And then the best blog would be Netizen of the Year. Seems like 100 years ago that we believed that stuff. Instead, what happened with amazing speed was that a relatively small number of near-monopoly companies took over the internet, took over the World Wide Web, and they created hierarchical structures. I love these org charts because they're authentically funny, and whoever did this cartoon is really cool. Because they have a sort of grain of truth in each case. And anybody who's worked for one of these companies will, I think, attest to that. But the point is that what we thought was going to be a decentralized, distributed, awesome, cool network where we'd just be adding nodes and blogging, with amazing speed became hierarchical. Because remember, phase transitions, emergent property, it's a complex system. It was never going to stay the way Tim designed it. Sorry, Tim. 2 consequences of the advent of the network platforms. The return of monopoly capitalism. My good friend Peter Thiel explaining why monopolies are awesome in his book 0 to 1, which was a huge bestseller, not least in China. I'll come to China in a minute. Scott Galloway's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, each one controlling one of your vital organs. Google is your brain. Facebook's your heart. Amazon's your gut where you do the consumption. And I won't say exactly what Apple is, except that phones are status symbols, I suppose. The advent of monopoly capitalism is kind of mind-blowing enough, and certainly not something that many people predicted, if any. Even more important is what the network platforms have done to democracy, and that's really what I want to focus on with the remaining time I have. If you were paying attention to the importance of social media during the 2016 election, you spotted that Donald Trump's probability of beating Hillary Clinton was way higher than all the political scientists and pundits were saying, who were using polling data and models of the pre-social media political system. He dominated her. He dominated her on Facebook. He dominated her on Twitter. He actually dominated her also on Google search. And just 8 years before, these platforms had been marginal in their importance. To understand what was going to happen in November 2016, you had to see that this had happened. Brad Parscale, who was Trump's digital director, put it very nicely. These social platforms are all invented by very liberal people on the West and East Coasts, and we figure out how to use it to push conservative values. I don't think they thought that would ever happen. The Economist nearly got it right, social media's threat to democracy. No, there's nothing undemocratic about populists winning elections. The real threat was to liberalism. The real threat was to be precise, the political middle ground. That was the thing that was threatened. We now know, and with every week we know more, that the Russians used Facebook and Twitter to disseminate fake news and extreme views. My favorite meme of Russian origin is the one on the bottom right there. Satan, if I win, Clinton wins. Jesus, not if I can help it. Press like to help Jesus win. I gotta hand it to Ivan in St. Petersburg. That is pretty smart shit. But here are a couple of interesting things. Number one, it turns out that liberals were more likely to retweet Russian content than conservatives. I guess this was, can you believe the crap these conservatives say? And the other thing is that Russian content was probably around 1% of all the political content on social media during the 2016 election campaign. That's not a lot. Most of the content was homegrown. Now, you can take your choice, depending on how you like to think about the historical process. In a very close election, everything can be regarded as the critical variable, from the weather to the Russians to the fact that Hillary Clinton didn't go to Wisconsin. But I want to suggest that the most plausible counterfactual for 2016 is that if it had not been for the network platforms, Donald Trump could not have won. If you imagine the election without Facebook, without Twitter, without YouTube, let's not forget, it would have been very hard for the Trump campaign to overcome its financial disadvantage. Facebook advertising is the killer app of modern politics because it's targeted, precision targeted, and cheap. And this is the key insight of 2016. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, things go very differently. China builds a firewall around its own internet and essentially keeps the Western, the US companies out. We laugh and say, that's like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall, as Bill Clinton famously put it. And the Chinese said, watch us nail Jell-O to the wall. Watch us also build the only tech companies in the world that can rival yours, which they proceeded to do. Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent are the only rivals in the world to the big internet companies we sometimes refer to by the acronym FANG. And another amazing thing, not only did the Chinese match Silicon Valley, in some domains they do better than Silicon Valley, like in mobile payments and in processing speed. The next time you're in China, if you haven't been for a while, you'll notice that everybody pays for things with their phones, and they laugh at you when you take out your credit card. That's because they have pulled ahead in fintech. And the ability that the big Chinese tech companies have to process vast numbers of transactions, not only exploiting the scale of the Chinese market, but increasingly expanding abroad into other emerging markets, also gives them an advantage in the artificial intelligence arms race. Unlike here, in China, the square and the tower at least appear to be in harmony. Jack Ma, last year, before he got his marching orders from Xi Jinping, said at a Communist Party conference, the political and legal system of the future is inseparable from big data. Bad guys won't even be able to walk into the square. I got a little kind of cold, shivery feeling in my spine when I read that quotation. First, I thought, excellent, he used the word square. This will help my book. And then I thought, wait, what does he mean by the square? Oh, yeah, in China, there's only one square. This was a coded reference to the way in which AI, big data, can be used to prevent there ever being another 1989 in Tiananmen Square. There are three models 3 ways of dealing with the problems that we've created with technology. The Chinese model is clear. The network platforms of China will be subordinated to the wishes of the party, and if necessary, if possible, a system of social credit will be built on the basis of the individual citizen's data that you might think of as totalitarianism 2.0. 1984, but with a portable telescreen that you volunteer to be under surveillance by. The European approach is different. The Europeans have no technology companies worth talking about. All they can do is tax, regulate, and fine the American companies, and that is what they're proceeding to do. George Soros at Davos earlier this year said, "It's only a matter of time before the global dominance of the US IT monopolies is broken. EU competition Commissioner Vestager will be their nemesis." But what happens here? What happens in the United States where these companies were born, where the internet was created? That's not clear. All I think I can say with any confidence is that there will be a struggle between the tower and the square. And it began with this little exchange on social media last year, and it is escalating to a remarkable extent this year. Mainly because conservatives have come to believe that they are going to be discriminated against by the network platforms because they are all run by liberals, and it will never be 2016 again. In my conceptual framework, this is the old battle between the square and the tower. If you think of Silicon Valley as the square and Trump Tower as the tower. But the difference is that, and this is another parallel with the 16th and 17th century, outside actors are just free to join in. The whole saga of the caravan, remember the caravan? To a remarkable extent, stories about the caravan of would-be illegal immigrants stroke asylum seekers marching towards the US border intent on deciding the outcome of the midterms, that whole story was generated on Facebook groups which turn out on close inspection to have foreign administrators. If you think things have been fixed at Facebook or fixed at YouTube, you've drunk the Kool-Aid again. Let me conclude, because I've gone on long enough. What can we learn from my big analogy? What can that very near 16th and 17th century experience of polarization, conflict, fake news, driven by a technological disruption, what can it teach us about today? Well, the answer is, we need a cyber Westphalia. We need to end our 30 Years' War, preferably before it begins. In 1648, Europeans finally drew a line under 130 years of religious conflict. It was done with two complex treaties, which defined what we now think of today as the sovereignty of states. Well, I want to suggest to you this evening that we need to get there, preferably without the intervening strife. This is my last slide, but it's got a lot of content. It's actually a single slide digesting a 20,000-word paper that was published last week by the Hoover Institution where I work, entitled "What is to be Done?" And in that paper, which is available free on the Hoover website, I try to address what we do. And I go through the 6 ideas that are kind of out there, and I reject 2.5 of them. I don't think it makes any difference whether there is net neutrality or not. That's just about the balance of power and profit between internet service providers and network platforms. It doesn't change a thing. I don't think that antitrust legislation can be resuscitated, as Tim Wu and others believe, and that these companies can be broken up. At least I don't think it can be done fast enough, given the strong bias of the US courts against the old version, the Brandeis version of antitrust, and in favor of the post-1960s Bork version. I think it's not a viable project. In any case, there are natural monopolies in the realm of networks, and this will be, I think, a blind alley. There needs to be regulation, more than there has been, and more effective regulation than there has been, but we mustn't make the mistake of thinking, oh, they're utilities, we should regulate them the way we regulated the railroads. What I argue in this paper is for three distinct steps. The first is to get rid of the strange, now anachronistic rule that exempts the network platforms from liability for the content that they carry on their platforms. This goes back to the mid-1990s when most of these companies didn't exist, and now makes no sense when they're the biggest companies in the world. Section 230 makes no sense when essentially these are the biggest content publishers in history. 80% of Americans, most of the people in this room, get their news via referral from either Google or Facebook. The pretense that they're just tech companies, that the liability for the content belongs with the original traditional media producer or the user who posted the comment, that seems to me an anachronism. But even as we expose the network platforms to liability for the content that they produce or publish, we must ensure that they don't become the censors of our public sphere. And that is the tendency that we currently see, partly under European pressure, partly because of European regulation. More and more is being done in the name of community standards. It's a slippery slope if we leave the network platforms to decide what is hate speech and what is not, what should appear in the rankings and what should not. That is too much power for private corporations to wield. Far too much. And that's why I make another proposal, which is to say that they should uphold the First Amendment because they have become the public sphere. And that's a controversial proposal. But I think it's necessary if we are to avoid the fate of a kind of privatized China in which content is censored by Facebook and Google on our behalf in deference to increasingly restrictive notions of what is hate speech. Last but not least, and this is the most Westphalian part of it, we need urgently an international convention on cyber war. We've had such conventions before on everything from piracy to biological weapons. The great powers represented today by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council need to recognize that this process of constant violation of one another's sovereignty, which is the essence of what happened in 2016, is dangerous to all of them. Now, there's a problem with that, which is to get Russia to stop behaving like a rogue regime on alternate days and a great power on the other days. But one lesson of the 17th century is that that can be done. The habit of violating sovereignty, which has been re-established in our time, can be broken. That is what they achieved in Westphalia in 1648. I hope I've persuaded you that history plus network science provide a useful way to think about our contemporary problems. I hope I've persuaded you, sir, that the analogy is not a frivolous one, but actually a deadly serious one. And now what I need to do is urge you to buy the book. Remember, you don't need to read it. You just need to own it. Thank you for paying attention to me, and invite Stuart Brand to come and join me up on the stage. Thanks very much.